An entire empire knelt before a lie. For centuries, popes placed crowns, kings bowed, and battles were fought, all because of a document that never existed. A piece of parchment forged in the shadows declared that Constantine, the first Christian emperor, had given Rome and the West to the Pope, and the world believed it. The cross became a scepter. Faith turned into a crown, and medieval politics was written in false ink. What you are about to hear was never taught in cathedrals, nor remembered at altars. You are on the channel Faith and Power. Subscribe, turn on the bell, and share, because this silenced truth changed empires, and still echoes to this day. There was a Rome weary, wounded by the weight of centuries. The Western Empire had fallen, yet its marble ruins still whispered memories of glory. In this setting, among the dust of basilicas and the corridors of papal power, something arose that had no body, yet carried a force that would shape centuries. A document, not a living decree from an emperor in flesh and blood, but a piece of paper written centuries after the supposed event it described. This ghost of ink would become known as the Donation of Constantine. The text claimed something extraordinary. According to it, Emperor Constantine, the first to officially grant freedom to Christianity, had gifted Pope Sylvester I with Rome, all of Italy, and essentially sovereignty over the West. In other words, popes would not only be spiritual leaders, they would also be temporal lords, kings without crowns, hidden emperors. It was the perfect fusion of altar and throne. But here lies the crucial detail. No one had seen this document in Constantine's time. No ancient historian mentioned its existence. Eusebius, the emperor's official biographer, who meticulously recorded his laws, victories, and conversions, never once cited such a colossal donation. For centuries, there was absolute silence, and suddenly, there it was, a text emerging in the middle of the Middle Ages, ready to legitimize papal ambition. The first recorded appearance of the document was in the 8th century amid the political turbulence between the papacy and the barbarian kings who contested Italy. Rome was under threat, the Lombards advanced, and the popes sought weapons not of iron, but of argument. And what better defense than an imperial decree, supposedly written 400 years earlier, declaring that the Bishop of Rome was, by divine and imperial right, sovereign over the city and vast lands? Here the mystery begins. Who wrote this text? We do not know. The author remains a faceless specter, but who used it, we know very well. The popes began to cite it, invoking its words before kings and ambassadors. It was like opening a chest filled with invisible crowns. Suddenly, the bishop in white could stare down monarchs and declare, "You rule because we allow it." To understand the impact, one must picture the European scene. Kings and nobles were accustomed to warring among themselves, but they held deep respect for the church's spiritual authority. If that authority now came backed by political legitimacy, then no throne was safe without Rome's seal. The donation of Constantine did not merely expand papal power, it redrew the map of authority itself, and the text did not hold back on grand words. It declared that Constantine, miraculously cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester, had recognized his spiritual superiority and, in gratitude, transferred not only Rome, but also the imperial insignia, the crown, the purple mantle, the scepter, even the very prerogatives of the emperor in the West. It was the perfect staging of the empire's submission to the church. The most shocking detail? The narrative was impossible to confirm. Constantine lived in the 4th century. Sylvester indeed was pope in that period, but no contemporary document describes such a miraculous cure. On the contrary, ancient records state that Constantine was baptized only on his deathbed, and not in Rome, but in Nicomedia, at the hands of an Arian bishop. The contrast between the sources is glaring, yet in the Middle Ages, historical criticism was weak. The authority of a text came not from documentary proof, but from its usefulness and convenience. And convenience there was in abundance. Whenever a king questioned the Pope's authority over lands, there was the donation, read aloud in solemn tones, as if it were the very echo of Constantine's pen. The scene repeated itself countless times. In assemblies, in territorial disputes, in political negotiations. The popes wielded it like an invisible sword. No blood needed to be spilled. The document spoke. And few dared to doubt, for to doubt the text was to doubt the church itself. But the signs of forgery were there, for those with trained eyes. Words and titles non-existent in the 4th century appeared in the text. Legal expressions typical of the Middle Ages slipped like shadows into the Latin. It was as if a medieval painter had tried to copy a Roman mosaic, beautiful from a distance, but full of anachronisms when seen up close. Still, fragile as it was, the document fulfilled its mission. For centuries, the donation of Constantine served as the ideological foundation for the papacy to assert supremacy not only over souls, but also over crowns. Many kings submitted, others rebelled. But all, without exception, had to contend with this paper ghost that rose between them and their thrones, and thus the legend was born. A non-existent text, written in silence, that became more powerful than armies. In medieval Rome, no sword was needed to conquer empires. A quill dipped in, ink was enough, along with the promise that Constantine's voice still echoed, even 400 years after his death. In the Middle Ages, power did not come only from sharp swords or high walls. It also came from words. A parchment could subdue an army, and a phrase written with the authority of an emperor had the power to change history. The donation of Constantine was living proof of this logic, a false text that built real kingdoms. When the document began to circulate, it fell like a bomb on the European stage. Picture Germanic, Lombard, and Frankish kings hearing clerics solemnly proclaim that all the territories of Italy and the West belonged by right to the Pope. This meant that any king ruling there was ultimately a vassal of Rome. Royal blood, lineage, or military victories didn't matter. Ink did. The impact was devastating. Popes like Stephen II and Adrian the Faun invoked the text to justify appeals for help from the Franks against the Lombards. It was a brilliant game. If the Pope was already the rightful lord of Italy, then any king who came to his aid was not merely protecting the church but restoring an ancient right. Thus, the document manufactured an aura of legality for strategic alliances. The most emblematic example came with Charlemagne. When Pope Leo III crowned him Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800, the ceremony was drenched in the spirit of the donation. Even if the text was not read aloud at that moment, its shadow hovered over St. Peter's Basilica. It was as if Constantine, from beyond the grave, authorized the transfer of imperial power to that Frankish king, so long as he recognized the primacy of the church. And Charlemagne understood the message. His empire flourished in alliance with Rome, but always under the tension of a question: who was the true master, the Pope who crowned or the emperor crowned? The donation of Constantine, silent, offered the convenient answer: the Pope. This situation transformed the papacy into the arbiter of European politics. Kings sought its blessing like men seeking water in the desert. A king without the church's backing could be deemed illegitimate, and an enemy of Rome could be branded as an enemy of God. The forged text provided the backdrop for this rhetoric, but there was an even more fascinating dimension: its symbolic use. The document was not only a tool of direct power, it worked as a psychological weapon. In an age when the sacred and political were inseparable, the idea that the first Christian emperor had handed the West to the Pope was irresistible. It didn't, matter if no one had ever seen the original parchment. The story alone was enough. It was myth turned into law. This aura was reinforced by rituals. When popes walked in purple mantles or wielded imperial insignia, they were staging the narrative of the donation. Every crown received, every banner raised, was a theatrical reminder that Rome already possessed these symbols thanks to Constantine. Thus, the false document became living spectacle. There was no shortage of kings who felt humiliated by this logic. The clash between Henry IV of Germany and Pope Gregory VII, in the episode known as the Humiliation of Canossa in the 11th century, was steeped in the idea that the emperor could only reign if the pope allowed it. Although the dispute centered on the appointment of bishops, its ideological foundation partly stemmed from the donation. The pope was superior because Constantine had given him the invisible crown. Here we see the genius of the fraud. It was not merely a dead text stored in libraries, it was a political weapon, activated in moments of crisis. And the more it was used, the stronger its authority became. The silence of the previous centuries was ignored. The absence of ancient witnesses did not matter. What mattered was that, in the present, the document offered a solid foundation for papal supremacy. Of course, not everyone accepted it passively. Some nobles and clerics raised eyebrows at its inconsistencies. The Latin of the text sounded more medieval than Roman. Ecclesiastical legal terms typical of the 8th century appeared as if they belonged to the 4th. It was like finding a smartphone in a Renaissance painting. Impossible, yet there for all to see. Even so, the power of myth was stronger than doubt. In a Europe engulfed by wars, famine, and plagues, few had time or courage to openly challenge Rome. The price of suspicion could be excommunication, and being cut off from the church meant being cut off from salvation itself. Better to bow before the document than risk the eternal soul, and so the donation of Constantine consolidated itself as one of the invisible pillars of medieval order. It turned monastic scribes into political engineers, who, by copying the text onto parchment, multiplied papal authority. Each copy was another chain binding kings and nobles to the spiritual throne of Rome. But every paper empire carries within it the seed of doubt. With the intellectual revival of the 12th century, when universities arose and the critical study of classical texts began to flourish, some scholars started to examine the donation more closely. They noticed the incongruities, the anachronisms, the errors. It was like watching the first cracks appear in a seemingly unshakable castle. Still, the document endured, and it would endure for centuries. It was far too convenient to be discarded. It served not only the church, but also kings who, at times, needed papal legitimacy against rivals. The fraud lived on because its usefulness outweighed the truth. This is the fascinating paradox of the donation of Constantine, a false text that became more real than reality itself. It did not need to be authentic to shape the destiny of entire peoples. It only needed to be believed. And as long as it was repeated in pulpits, courts, and coronations, it continued to govern the dance between cross and sword. Paper had become sharper than the blade. For centuries, kings, monks, and even emperors bowed before the specter of the donation of Constantine. But every lie carries within itself the seed of its ruin. With the rebirth of critical thought in medieval Europe, voices began to rise, daring to ask, what if this document was a fraud? The first whisper of suspicion did not come from violent rebels, but from observant scholars. In the court of Emperor Otto III, in the 10th century, there were already murmurs that the text seemed odd. Some German clerics questioned, how could Constantine, living in Nicomedia and Constantinople, have written a document filled with terms typical of medieval Rome? The Latin sounded misplaced, almost as if written by later hands. These suspicions, however, were smothered under the weight of papal authority. To contest the donation was not merely an intellectual act, It was a political and spiritual one. It meant confronting the power of the church, risking excommunication, and perhaps death. Many chose silence, but in the 11th and 12th centuries, as universities flourished in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, the critical reading of ancient texts reignited the flame of doubt. Professors and jurists began to notice contradictions. How could Constantine have called Constantinople the New Rome in a text supposedly written before the city's official construction? How to explain references to ecclesiastical customs that would only appear centuries later? The great turning point came in the 15th century. A man with piercing eyes and a sharp mind, Lorenzo Valla, launched the definitive accusation. An Italian humanist, trained in the tradition of classical Renaissance, he knew ancient Latin and medieval Latin inside out. In 1440, Valla wrote his famous work Declamation on the Donation of Constantine, a frontal attack against the document that had upheld centuries of papal supremacy. His method was simple but devastating. He compared the style of the donation with authentic 4th century writings. The result: there was no way that text could be Constantine's. Expressions, grammatical constructions, even entire words clearly belonged to the Middle Ages. It was like finding modern slang in a Roman manuscript. Valla exposed the document as a fraud with the precision of a surgeon. He not only proved its falsity, he ridiculed it. He asked how anyone could believe that an emperor, cured miraculously of leprosy, would hand the heart of his empire to a bishop. He denounced its exaggeration, its theatricality, and the absence of any historical testimony. His work spread among scholars like wildfire in a dry field, and here irony enters. The Pope reigning when Valla wrote, Eugene IV, did not punish him severely. Why? Because Valla was protected by powerful patrons, including the King of Naples. Truth was beginning to find cracks even within Christendom itself. Still, the reaction was not uniform. Many clerics continued to defend the donation, claiming that even if it was false as a document, it was true in spirit. The argument was peculiar. It did not matter whether Constantine had truly written those words. What mattered was that the Church did in fact hold divine authority over the West. In other words, the fraud was accepted because it supported a convenient truth. This reasoning reveals the deeper conflict symbolized by the donation. The struggle between faith and criticism, between tradition and investigation. For many, questioning the document meant opening the door to questioning the entire structure of the Church. If one of the cornerstones of papal supremacy was false, what else? Might have been built on sand? This dilemma haunted European consciousness for centuries. When Martin Luther launched the Reformation in the 16th century, denunciations of church corruption and falsehoods found fertile soil precisely because minds like Valla's had already planted the seeds of doubt. Although Luther did not make the donation his central target, his generation already knew not everything that came from Rome was worthy of trust. The donation, then, was not merely a false document. It became a symbol of the tension between the Church and its critics. Every time someone raised the question of its authenticity, the debate was reignited over how far papal authority truly extended. The text ceased to be just a tool of power and became an ideological battlefield. What is most fascinating is that even after Valla's exposure, the donation did not vanish immediately. It continued to be cited, repeated, and used, especially in regions where humanist critique had not yet penetrated. It was like a ghost that, even once unmasked, insisted on haunting. This delay in abandoning the fraud shows the strength of tradition. When a lie is repeated for centuries, it takes on a life of its own. Overthrowing it requires more than rational evidence. It demands courage to face centuries of habits and vested interests. And here lies the great irony of history. The document that never existed, once unmasked, did not dissolve into silence. On the contrary, it lived on at another level. as a symbol of a system that preferred convenience over scrutiny. Voices of rebellion began timidly, but over time they became thunder. Valla's critique echoed through the halls of Renaissance. Humanism, fueling the spirit of the Reformation and modernity. The lie had fulfilled its purpose, but its fall opened the way for something greater, the rediscovery of the power of truth. The donation of Constantine had already been unmasked. Lorenzo Valla, with his sharp pen, had shown the world that the document was nothing more than a medieval forgery. But if the lie had been exposed, why did it continue to echo? Why, even after humanist criticism, did the shadow of the donation still shape decisions, alliances, and wars? The answer is simple and unsettling, because power rarely feeds on truth. It feeds on usefulness. For the medieval church, the donation was not merely a piece of paper. It was the visible embodiment of a principle, the supremacy of the spiritual over the temporal. To topple the document was not just to deny a fraud. It was to threaten the entire edifice built upon it. And that edifice included territories, taxes, political alliances, and the very prestige of the papacy. Even after Valla's work, many clerics and canonists defended the idea that, even if false, the donation was true in spirit. After all, was it not evident that the church should stand above kings? Was it not natural that the successor of Peter held supreme authority over Christians and empires? The lie was transformed into allegory, and the allegory into a convenient dogma. This reasoning allowed the donation to continue to be cited in documents and sermons, especially in regions far from the intellectual centers of the Renaissance. The common people, mostly illiterate, knew nothing of the debate. For them, if the priest said that Constantine had given Rome to the Pope, that was enough. Faith required no philological proof, but the rulers knew. And that is where the game changed. With the strengthening of national kingdoms in the late Middle Ages, kings and princes began to see in the exposure of the donation an opportunity. If the Pope had no historical legitimacy over territories and crowns, then monarchs had more room to assert their independence. France, England, Spain, all began processes of reinforcing royal power in direct confrontation with Rome. The legacy of the lie, therefore, was paradoxical. For centuries, the donation had subjected kings to papal authority, but once unmasked, it became a symbol of the need for liberation. The same document that had served as a weapon for Rome became ammunition for its critics. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses in 1517, the critical spirit was already alive. The memory of the donation fueled widespread distrust of the papacy. If one of the greatest pillars of Rome's supremacy had been built on falsehood, why believe in its indulgences? Why trust its claim to infallibility? Thus, Constantine's lie lived on, but in a new form, as proof that the Church could manipulate history to serve its interests. This perception became fuel for the Protestant Reformation. Calvin, Melanchthon, and other reformers often evoked examples of corruption and fraud to show that Rome was not trustworthy. The donation was among the most powerful examples. The Council of Trent, convened to respond to the Reformation, avoided directly discussing the case of the donation. The silence was strategic. To admit the fraud openly would be to concede victory to the enemies. Rome preferred to let the document die slowly without an official funeral. To this day, the Catholic Church has never issued a formal condemnation. It simply stopped citing it. But the absence of explicit condemnation reveals something deeper: the difficulty of admitting that centuries of authority rested on sand. The legacy of the lie was not only historical, it was psychological and theological. It reminded everyone that truth can be suffocated when power demands it, and paradoxically, that legacy helped shape the modern world. By exposing the falsity of the donation, Valla and the humanists opened the way for a new era. the age of documentary, criticism, of historical analysis, of healthy skepticism. From then on, ancient documents would no longer be accepted blindly. They would be interrogated, compared, tested. The medieval lie, unintentionally, gave birth to the modern historical method. The impact was profound. Universities began to value the rigorous study of sources. Kings began to finance intellectuals who could sustain their political claims against Rome. And historical science itself began to emerge as an autonomous discipline. In a sense, we owe to the donation of Constantine and to Valla's courage the rise of the critical spirit that today guides our understanding of the past. But the legacy does not end there. The donation also left a cultural and symbolic mark. It remains an eternal example of how a text can govern multitudes without ever truly existing. A dark reminder that words, when accepted without question, can subjugate kings and shape centuries. Possession. Fraud became, ironically, truth in its effect. Constantine never wrote such a document, but his supposed donation shaped European politics, legitimized coronations, sustained battles, and justified massacres. The lie outlived many real kingdoms. Today, looking back, we realize that the donation of Constantine is more than an isolated episode. It is a metaphor for the human power to create realities out of narratives. When a lie is repeated with solemnity, surrounded by symbols and protected by institutions, it becomes indistinguishable from truth until someone dares to tear the veil. And when that veil is torn, the world is never the same again. Centuries have passed since the donation of Constantine was revealed as a forgery. The parchments that once upheld thrones and crowns now rest in libraries, treated as curiosities of a distant past. Yet the echo of that lie still resounds, not only in the history of the Church, but in the very way the modern world thinks about power, truth, and faith. The false document was not merely a stain on the papacy's reputation. It became a universal symbol of the danger that arises when faith is entangled with political manipulation. Each time the donation is studied, a question opens before us. How many other truths do we accept without question? How many invisible documents still shape our lives today, upheld more by habit than by reality? This echo carried into modernity. During the Enlightenment, philosophers like Voltaire and Edward Gibbon used the case of the donation as an example of human credulity and the corruption of religious institutions. To them, the fact that the Church had sustained an empire upon a forgery was the ultimate proof that reason should replace blind faith. The medieval lie was transformed into ammunition against religion in the modern world. But the echo is not only negative. There is also a positive lesson. The courage of Lorenzo Valla inaugurated a tradition of documentary criticism that today guides both historical scholarship and investigative journalism. His work anticipated the principle that no power stands above truth, that every authority, no matter how sacred it seems, must be tested against evidence. That heritage lives on every time someone exposes a fraud or unmasks a convenient narrative. In contemporary politics, the case of the donation of Constantine is often recalled as a metaphor for the great lies that sustain modern empires. If a medieval parchment could legitimize centuries of papal dominion, what of the ideologies, manipulated constitutions, and propaganda that shape nations today? The power of words remains as dangerous as in the Middle Ages. And here lies the most unsettling point. The donation reminds us that a lie does not need to be believed by all to be effective. It only needs to be repeated, performed, and accepted by those in authority. Medieval people did not demand to see the document. It was enough to hear that it existed. In the same way, today, many people do not verify facts. They simply accept the narratives handed to them. Yet the echo of the donation also reverberates within the Church itself. Though the Vatican no longer invokes the document, its memory lingers as a wound. Many modern Catholics ask, how could an institution that proclaims eternal truth sustain for centuries such an obvious falsehood? The answer lies not only in medieval history, but in the human heart, the temptation of power. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of the donation of Constantine, to show that even the sacred can be manipulated when mingled with the thirst for dominion. The cross, the symbol of Christ's absolute self-giving, was used as an argument to justify crowns and territories. The price was high. Centuries of wars, intrigues, and blood spilled in the name of a lie. Still, the echo need not end in despair. It can become a warning. The donation calls us to look with critical eyes, to resist accepting ready-made narratives merely because they come clothed in sacred symbols or authoritative voices. It invites us to seek truth always, even when uncomfortable, even when it threatens ancient traditions. At the same time, the echo of the donation makes us reflect on the nature of faith itself. If a fraud could sustain empires, does that prove the fragility of belief, or its strength? After all, the lie worked only because it leaned on something real, the deep conviction that the church should have spiritual authority over the world. The fraud did not create this conviction, it merely exploited it. Perhaps the true lesson lies here. Faith is too powerful to be manipulated. When placed in the service of truth, it illuminates. When used as an instrument of power, it oppresses. The donation of Constantine was the classic example of faith hijacked by political interest, and its fall was the announcement that truth, sooner or later, finds a voice. Today, when we recall this episode, we are not only speaking of an ancient document, we are speaking of ourselves, of the narratives we accept without examination, of the authorities we follow without question, of the invisible Constantines that still shape the course of our lives. The donation of Constantine never existed, but its shadow still walks among us. Centuries of power built upon a page that never existed. The donation of Constantine is more than a medieval fraud. It is a reminder that empires can be born from words, not from facts. That a lie, when staged with solemnity, can subdue kings, crown popes, and define the destiny of entire civilizations. But there is something even more disturbing. The document that never existed shows that truth can be silenced when it suits the powerful. It shows that the sacred can be manipulated, that faith can be hijacked and used as a weapon. And it forces us to ask the inevitable question, how many other donations still shape our lives, unseen, repeated until they seem real? Perhaps the greatest lesson of the donation of Constantine is not about the past, but about us, about the courage to doubt, to investigate, to tear apart veils that centuries have tried to keep closed. For if a false text could rule the Middle Ages, what new myth might rule our own time? The lie has died, but its echo remains. It is up to us to decide whether we will be subjects of ghosts or seekers of truth. You have just walked through one of the darkest and most fascinating chapters in the history of Christianity, and if this journey made you reflect, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel Faith and Power, turn on the bell, and share this video, because only together can we continue to unearth the secrets that change the world and may still change the future.